Hello and welcome to this edition of the Vermont Report on Palestine-Israel. I'm Mark Hage. We'll begin this episode with a report on the ground in post-ceasefire Gaza with the intrepid Palestinian journalist Bassam Ouda. That will be followed by two reports featuring commentary and the experiences of two physicians, Dr. Victoria Rose, who's a British reconstructive surgeon, who has served on two medical teams in Gaza since October 7th of 2023. She worked around the clock during her time there. 90% of her patients were children. Dr. Tanya Haj Hassan is a pediatric physician. She has worked in Gaza as a doctor multiple times over the last decade. And recently, in a press conference at the United Nations headquarters in Geneva, she said, "As one of the few international observers allowed into Gaza, I can tell you, spend just 5 minutes in a hospital there, and it will become painfully clear the Palestinians are being intentionally massacred, starved, and stripped of everything needed to sustain life." Here now is Bassam Ouda, followed by interviews with Dr. Victoria Rose and commentary by Dr. Tanya Haj Hassan.
Everyone, this is Bassam. I am still alive and talking to you from Gaza Strip, where more than 70% of the residential buildings were destroyed in a 1 year of ongoing genocide. But the question now is, where can the people who used to live in these neighborhoods and survived the destruction and the genocide live after all of this? وين ساكن هالبيت انت؟ كيف وضع البيت؟
انا عملت مدخل زي ما انت شايفه اللي 4 أيام بشتغل فيه. تفضل اطلع فوق. الشقة رايحة بس ضايع الغرفة. بمشي حالي فيه. احسن من الخير. ما انت مصور هذا الصبح برضه عشان قصة الحمام وبحط هنا احجار بصفط احجار 6 مدامية. بعدين بحط بطانية. وبقيت غرض يعني فلسه انا بشتغل اول يوم يعني اخش الشقه لسه انظف. اللي خلاني ارجع المرمطه. غرفه في داري احسن من قصر برا بالنسبه لي يعني.
Here behind me is a home. The first floor is destroyed and there is no entrance for the home. So people put a stairs here, opened a door into the wall of the next floor and kept their plants alive. مين صاحب فكرة الدرج هذا؟
أبوي دعمه.
طب شايف إنه صح الواحد يرجع حتى لو في دمار؟
في الدار أحسن.
طب ما هي مدمرة.
دارنا أحسن من أي مكان.
As you can see here, people, because of the lack of the options, we don't have any places to go to. So people now are returning back to their homes and trying to rebuild anything, like any wall. Look there.
غصب عنهم هنعمرها مرة ومرتين و10. عندنا نعمر قال يوم لقيام وقاعدين لهم هان قاعدين.
تعالوا وين ساكنين؟ شو صار في داركم؟
احنا هنا عشان احنا ضايلين على نص.
احكوا لي شو بتعملوا هنا؟ شو؟
نتزحلق.
طب ما حدش حكى لكم انه خطر تتزحلقوا في مكان فيه ركام مثلا؟ خطر. طب ليه بتتزحلقوا؟
عشان فيش مراجيح.
اطفال غزة بدون حل. بس منطقي بتقدرش ترد عليه، بيحكي لك فيش مراجيح فبتزحلق على ركام البيت.
The children seem to be specifically hit by quadcopters, which are drones that have firepower capability, and lots of them were sort of shot in the back, in the head, in the upper torso.
These are the intentional targeting of children, and they're quadcopters, so they're following.
So they're operated by somebody that's watching what they're doing. So I assume that they are.
Welcome to Reframe, where we seek new conversations and perspectives. I'm Fatima Bhutto, and in this series we'll be discussing one of the biggest stories of our time, the war in Gaza and how international doctors are responding to it. My guest this week is British plastic and reconstructive surgeon, Dr. Victoria Rose. Dr. Rose has had first-hand experience observing the destruction of the healthcare system by Israeli forces, and especially its devastating impact on children. Thank you so much for joining us today, Victoria. Your work, it's beyond admirable, and watching you speak and seeing what you've done is really so moving. You are a British NHS doctor, but you have no family ties to Gaza. You didn't grow up there, you don't really have any direct connections. What was it that made you pack your bags and go out there?
I first went to Gaza in 2019, I think, or it could be 18, and I was shamed into going by my colleagues. I work at King's College Major Trauma Centre, and two of my colleagues were very influential in a charity called Ideals. They were both orthopaedic surgeons, and Ideals is a charity that offers sort of aid and support to sort of international disasters and war zones. And they had picked Gaza in 2009 and had done some trauma courses there. Initially, I didn't get involved. As time went on, I could see what they were doing, and I went and I did 2 missions. And as soon as I got there, I realised that the problem was that there are no plastic surgeons in Gaza, or no trained plastic surgeons in Gaza. So there are general surgeons that have developed some plastic surgery skills. So there's a very good burn surgeon, but he trained through general surgery. But there's nobody that could do any plastic surgery problem. And I started in 2019 looking for somebody that we could train. Ahmed Mokkalalati, who is a plastic surgeon from Gaza, and he said, I want to learn how to do trauma. And he worked with me for 2 years. He did the first cleft lip and palate repair by a Gazan surgeon. He did a breast reconstruction case. And so every sort of month or every other week, I was getting these photos of the amazing stuff that he was doing, and I was just so proud of him. And then in October, the pictures changed, and he was sending me very different footage. Yeah. And he sent me a picture, I remember this very well, on the 31st of October, and it was a 7-year-old, and he said, I don't know what to do. I think I'm going to have to amputate. What do you all think I should do? And at that point, I sort of said, I think we need to go and help him.
And the first time you went, because you went twice since October the 7th, the first time you were in Gaza, what was your role? What were you doing on a daily basis in the hospitals?
We'd been given emergency medical team status by the Ministry of Health for the missions, and we put a plan together to say that our aim would be to work with our colleagues in Gaza and to take as much medical equipment with us as we could. So that was my agenda, but I operated 24/7 for 2.5 weeks.
Can you describe what the atmosphere of working under those conditions, under siege, under attack, what that was like?
I don't think I really thought very much about where I was and what was happening outside the hospital walls, because there was just so much to do. It was just relentless, constant people to see, constant wounds that needed debriding. You never got on top of it. Every time I finished a case, somebody would show me something else, and it was just all absorbing, and all you kept thinking is, right, I've got to do this, and then we're going to do that, and then this chap needs to come back to theatre, and it just kept going, and you just didn't really stop.
And you've said, Victoria, that close to 90% of those you operated on in Gaza were children. UNICEF has called Gaza the world's most dangerous place to be a child. From what you saw, why would UNICEF say that?
I think that as time went on, we saw more and more children, and certainly when I went back in the August, we were at NASA for a month, and I operated again every day, and most of my lists were just children.
What was it? Burns? Was it amputations?
It's in an explosion, when a blast goes off, everything around you gets weaponised. So all the masonry and bits of car sort of get whipped up in that energy, and then they hit a civilian at quite a high velocity, and that will penetrate the skin, and it will either break the bone underneath or it will penetrate the chest or the abdomen. And that was the bulk of what we were seeing. But we also saw a lot of burns because of the heat of the blast. And then we saw bullet injuries. So we saw a lot of sniper injuries, but the children seemed to be specifically hit by quadcopters, which are drones that have firepower capability. And lots of them were sort of shot in the back, in the head, in the upper torso.
These are the intentional targeting of children? I mean, if it's the head and torso and back? And they're quadcopters, so they're following.
So they're operated by somebody that's watching what they're doing. So I assume that they are targeting children. What we saw was that the bulk of the children were between the age of 5 and probably 15. And when we were with MSF, the theory was that all of the children under 5 were of an age where their parents would pick them up and run with them. And obviously anyone 15 and older is quite agile on their feet and can run away. But that tranche of children between 5 and 15 are often sort of, confused by what's going on, are not the quickest to get up. And so that was, I think, why we saw so many injuries in that age group.
And the trauma that these children must face, it's been said of Gaza that there's no post-traumatic stress disorder because there's no post. Did you experience this? Were you able to spend time in some cases with these children?
There definitely were children that have huge psychological issues. We had a 7-year-old called Mohammed who had been in a blast injury that had brought the house down that he was in, and he was with his father. And in the blast, his father had died, and his mother spoke beautiful English. And she said to me, he just won't speak to me, he won't look at you, he doesn't want to engage with any of the doctors, he just wants to see his father. It was quite a difficult problem because I was watching him not recover from an injury that he should recover from, in that we had amputated his leg and we'd closed it and we'd grafted it, and we had closed all the wounds on his other leg, but the wounds just didn't heal. He wasn't eating, he kept getting infections, he just wasn't progressing, and that totally is due to his mental state.
And we know, of course, now that Gaza has the largest cohort of child amputees in the world. You said that doctors in Gaza are journalists now. I mean, they're killing the journalists, and so it's doctors like yourself who are telling us what's happened. But of course, we know that over 1,000 healthcare workers have also been killed by Israel. Doctors, paramedics, healthcare workers have also been abducted, detained, tortured. Were there doctors who you spent time with in Gaza who moved you particularly, who you will always keep with you?
Lots and lots. When I was at Nasser in August, I worked with an anaesthetist who told me that he had been taken from Shifa and held in an Israeli prison for 43 days, where his hands were tied behind his back and he was blindfolded. He lost 10 kilos in weight, and he said he was beaten every day and then released. And I remember looking at him and thinking, I can't believe that you're back at Nasser working. And I think there is this massive feeling of responsibility of the healthcare teams in Gaza to continue coming to work in some, terrible circumstances. Fadi, who was one of my theatre nurses, had come back after 6 weeks off, and his 10-year-old son had been killed in a blast. And one of my other colleagues showed me footage of Fadi running to pick his son up dead off the floor and carrying him out of the sort of area. He had 3 children, 2 girls and a 10-year-old boy, and you just, what do I say to him when he comes back to work? It's, you know, it's... But then everybody that you speak to has lost a sibling, a mother, a father. I mean, obviously the ones that have lost children you feel more for because you don't expect to lose your children. But I don't think I met anyone that was unscathed by this.
And in the time that you were there in these hospitals, were there quiet moments? Was there light moments between the doctors?
Yes, yeah, there were. I mean, I think medicine is like that. You have to sort of make the best of what you have, and we certainly had a lot of interesting sort of scrap heap challenge moments when we ran out of stuff that we had to improvise for, and obviously you're all in the same situation together, and they are so grateful that you've come to help them, that there is this sort of, you know, lovely bond between you. So there's a lot of camaraderie.
You said that you went twice, and the first time your mandate was to bring as many supplies in.
Yeah.
The second time you went back to Gaza, did you have a different experience?
Well, the first time we went in, we travelled via Cairo through the Sinai Desert and crossed at Rafah. And we were in the UN convoy, and there was no restriction really on what you could take. You could take whatever you could get into your minibus. So we managed to take 25 suitcases with us in the march full of medical equipment. And obviously we had colleagues inside who told us what they were short of. So it was almost, you know, a perfect sort of scenario for us in that we turned up with everything that they needed and extra hands. In August, we travelled through Israel and we crossed at Kerem Shalom, which is controlled by COGAT, who are the Commission for Activities in the Territories, so basically Israel. And they had restricted lots of things, including the number of people that could enter. So in March, we were in a convoy of 19 vans with major NGOs and minor charities. There were so many doctors and nurses. In August, Graham and I were the only 2 surgeons on the coach. There were only 20 seats on the coach. Only 5 of them went to emergency medical teams. All of us could only take 1 bag in, and it had to weigh 23 kilos. And we were told that we had to take our own food for a month.
In your bag?
Yes.
Plus your supplies?
Yes.
And did you have to bring your own water as well?
You had to take your own water for 3 days. That was the advice.
So what medical equipment could you take?
Well, I packed a very small kit. I think from the March trip I knew the surgery I needed to do. I had a friend who had left NASA who told me that, you know, what kit they didn't have. My theatre sister at Thomas's packed me a very small set of instruments, and I went in with a few disposable bits and pieces, and yeah, we got by.
We're going to turn to the audience in a second, but I just want to ask, would you go back?
Yes. I think when you go and you know that you're making a difference, it's very hard not to go back. And the only thing that stops me going back is my family, and particularly my other half, Philip. And I know how difficult it is for Philip when I go. And that's the only reason that I'm ever reticent about going back, is I need to make sure that he's comfortable. If I can sort of get him round, we are looking at going back in February.
If you've got a question for Victoria, please put your hand up. We've got one over there.
I am constantly shocked about how people in the UK and just the West in general are not unanimously outraged about what's going on. So I was wondering, what would you like to see journalists do to combat what you say, the unengaged population? How do we make them see, and how do we make them care?
I'm not 100% convinced that they're unengaged and they don't care. More and more I think that the government doesn't speak for the majority of the population. Everybody I know feels the same as I do, including my Jewish friends. So I don't know where this is coming from, that nobody gives a damn about Palestine and what's happening in Gaza. I think that is coming at a higher level, and I think we need to continue demonstrating and making it known that we're not supporting what the government are doing with regard to this war.
I'll just take the lady in the back.
Do you think there's a real disconnect between what's happening on the ground and what we're seeing here? And how does that make you feel if you do think that exists?
In the media and in the general, yeah.
I do think there's a real disconnect. I don't think that we are seeing exactly what's going on over there. I think a lot of the younger generation think that it's fine, that you're getting the feed that you need from the Palestinians who are putting it on Instagram and TikTok, but those platforms are not designed to deliver news. They're designed to keep you on them, to sell products and adverts. So your feed may contain some footage from Palestinians, but that's not the majority of feed. Lots of other people are still getting memes of kittens and puppies. So you can't consider that to be a news outlet for the masses. And that's what I've noticed. It's the same people that are approaching me to talk to university students, to talk to Al Jazeera. And there's a tranche that just isn't interested in what's happening. And it's those people that I think we need to engage, because I think if they could see what was going on, they would change their opinions of the situation.
We've got a question over here.
I work for War Child, and we provide trauma counselling and child protection services in Gaza. And what's changed more recently for us is our teams now say that they see signs of acute and complex trauma on every child that they see, that they meet and encounter. The humanitarian community's never had to respond to acute trauma at a population level before. So what do you feel would be needed from the international community to respond to the longer-term mental health impacts in Gaza?
I think we are going to have to look very hard at mental health support. I don't know how many of the NGOs prioritise mental health in their medical teams now, but it's going to be needed once we can get back in.
Is it even manageable to do that at a population level?
I think it is manageable. Catherine, who worked with us, who was from Norway, was seeing every child that we operated on, and she had a team of local Palestinian psychotherapists. What you need to remember is everybody thinks that Gaza was this sort of, whole of a place where it was all full of refugees that barely spoke English. It's not, and it's never been like that. They're hugely well educated. All of the women have professions. There's lots of physiotherapists that were Palestinian, loads of occupational therapists, lots of psychotherapists, and they had all come back to work and were working. So they have a huge number of their own teams that will continue. And they've even restarted training their medical students. So when we went in March, the medical students had obviously been, the medical schools had been destroyed in the first wave. But in September they reopened, and they continued to do their medical school exams. And 3 of our students are sitting their final exams now.
Extraordinary. We've got a question over here.
So after the missions in Gaza, how did it affect your life after, when you came back to the UK?
A lot of people said, did I suffer sort of post-traumatic stress, or how was it with what I've seen? I have to remember that every day when I go to work at King's, I see, small children that have run out in front of a car whose lives are going to change, indefinitely for them and their family. And I also, in the rest of my time, tell people on see people on a fairly regular basis who are going to die from cancer. So I have always had this as part of my life. But the thing that I find really hard to get over is I can never stop cancer, and I can never stop 4-year-olds running in front of cars on Brixton High Road. But if we had a ceasefire tomorrow, I possibly wouldn't have to see another burnt 7-year-old in Gaza. And that's really hard to to rationalise.
I can take one more question if someone's going to be very precise.
Yeah, hi, so I'm Lucy, I'm from the UK. I'm a journalism student now and I used to work for a Palestinian children's charity that worked in Gaza. Yeah, so over the last year, obviously hospitals normally are meant to be a place of safety where people go to be safe. And over the last year, obviously we've seen the opposite, instances where hospitals have been targeted. How concerned were you of this fear while you were there, or were you just so busy constantly dealing with cases that it wasn't even in your mind at the time?
I think in the March it wasn't really in my mind. When we got to the Rafah crossing, we had our journey deconflicted with the IDF, and then I was at the hospital, and I don't think I really thought too much about my safety. In August, we were partnered with MSF, and they take security very seriously. They had 2 of their vehicles targeted, and that never made the news because the people that were killed were Palestinian medics. So they had their fingers burnt, and they were really conscientious, and every night we had to do a security briefing with them where we would go through a map of the territory, what our escape route would be, where the car would be, who was driving, and every night there would be a conversation that went, I'm not sure whether you'll be able to go to the hospital tomorrow. And at the time I just remember being infuriated by them, that they weren't, letting us just get on with work. But now that I'm back and I look at how on top of it they were, I think, I'm very grateful I was with them. They took security very seriously.
This might be an impossible question, but do you have a profound memory from your time in Gaza that will always stay with you?
I had a group of medical students that I inherited from the European Gaza Hospital, and there were 8 of them. It was only due to them that I got through the volume of work that I got through. I became very fond of them, and when I knew I was going back in August, on our group chat, I said, this is where I'm going to be. And we decided that I would take some time off on a Sunday and have breakfast together. And on the Saturday morning, Abdul Rahman died. His house got bombed in a single fire attack, and he was killed with his aunt and his cousin, and he was 21, and he was a third-year medical student. The following day, obviously, nobody turned up. Everybody was really depressed, and it was really difficult. But then on the Monday, they all came, and we sat in the garden, and we sort of talked about, what was happening with medical schools, and how Abdul Rahman's parents were. And then Abdul Rahman's sister contacted me, and she said to me, "You really inspired him. Thank you very much. Don't forget him."
Thank you so much, Victoria, for everything you've done and you do, and that you will do in the future.
Our final report is an interview by Al Jazeera with the renowned trauma expert, Dr. Gabor Mate. In this interview, he reflects on the evolution of his thinking regarding Palestine-Israel, and more importantly, the weaponization or exploitation of Jewish trauma to justify Israel's occupation and its genocide in Gaza. Here now is Dr. Gabor Mate.
Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Hey everyone, Malika here. Before we get to today's episode, just to note that my conversation was recorded before the announcement of a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Today, when trauma becomes a weapon.
This is a very emotional issue. It's not about intellectual facts or historical facts or debates about realities.
Renowned doctor and author Gabor Mate's journey from embracing Zionism to rejecting it, and what his work tells us about trauma as a driving force for violence. I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take.
My name is Gabor Mate. I'm a retired physician, author of 5 books published in over 40 languages, and I do a lot of speaking internationally on issues of health, body and mind unity, stress, child development, addiction, and trauma. I also speak on the Israel-Palestine issue, which is very close to my heart.
Well, Dr. Mate, it is so good to have you on The Take. You've been all over all of my social feeds on all of those topics, but today we're going to be talking about that last one. You are a Holocaust survivor, born in Hungary, and later, growing up in Canada, you became a Zionist. In your work, you explore the many ways that trauma can shape an individual and society. And I want to start with how that's played out in your own life. How do you think the trauma of your family's history influenced your life and your earlier beliefs about Zionism?
Well, so I was an infant in 1944 when the Nazis occupied Hungary. So I spent the first year of my life under Nazi occupation during the genocide of Hungarian Jews, where over 500,000 people were sent to their deaths within a space of 3 or 4 months. The rest of that year were spent much of it under a very vicious anti-Semitic Nazi-like government in Hungary. My mother and I barely survived. My father was in forced labor, and my grandparents died in Auschwitz. Now, the stress of that first year, and then forced separation from my mother when I was 11 months of age, all of that had a huge impact on the development of my personality. It also gave me a sense of how precarious it is to be a Jew in Eastern Europe. And that had a huge impact on my not compulsion, but my call towards Zionism later on, because Zionism appeared to me as a teenager here in Canada as the perfect answer to that horrific history. It was like a redemption, a regaining of power, an assertion of a positive, proud Jewish identity, and really an antidote to hundreds of years of persecution.
Well, first of all, I'm so sorry to have you retell that story and for what you lived through. There's a painting by your wife that I'm looking at here on my screen, and it's a photo of you at about 3 months old with your mother under Nazi occupation. So it's a painting of a picture. Your mother's wearing the mandated yellow star. What do you recall looking back now about that picture? What does it make you feel now? What can you tell us?
So the painting by my wife, she did that because she wanted to understand her husband. And it's the actual photograph itself. And that was taken by a neighbor. And the neighbor says, "Why do you want to wear this badge of shame for this photograph?" And my mother said, "If my son survives, I want him to see what happened." In the photograph itself, and very well captured by my wife in her painting, that's not the eyes of a 3-month-old. Those are the eyes of an old person. There's a real depth of sadness in that photograph, and I've carried that all my life. And so that affected my life in multiple ways. When I look at it now, 2 things come up. One is that no infant should have to go through that. And that includes the infants in Gaza who are suffering this bombing and these deaths and the loss of their parents and this deprivation. The other is something about the goodness of life, because I did survive, and I survived due to the love of my mother, the love even of strangers without going to the whole history. So that photograph brings up to me both sorrow but also gratitude.
And what an act of love by your wife to take that on to better understand you. Thank you for sharing that. You said you used to think about Zionism as an antidote to the years of persecution, but over time, you later came to reject Zionism. You've been a very vocal critic of Israel's policies from long before October 7th in 2023. Can you take me through that transformation? What did you learn that changed your mind?
I learned reality. I learned history. In the Zionist movement, you get a certain view of history, which basically is one of suffering, redemption, and triumph of the Jewish people. But you never hear that in that land where this redemption and supposed triumph took place, there was another people connected to the land who had to be displaced and suppressed and denied their rights for the Zionist movement to achieve its goal. And that reality is not retrospective. That was known all along, so that Zionism necessarily made a decision that our suffering justifies the suffering of another people. And that has had horrific consequences on the Palestinians. It has also had consequences on the Jewish people that I think are lamentable. And interestingly enough, those consequences were foreseen right from the beginning. So this whole idea that Jewishness is identified with Zionism was never true. There was always prominent Jews, visionary Jews who didn't accept Zionism for its corrupting influence on the Jewish soul. And unfortunately, everything they predicted has come true.
Do you remember the moment for you, though, that let's call it an epiphany, came to be?
Well, there's no moment. There was a process. The process began with when I was in the Zionist movement, and I was the leader of a local Zionist group. But at some point, for a conference, I was given the task of how do we counter Arab propaganda on the campuses. I'm talking in the early 1960s here.
Wow. It sounds so similar to what we're hearing right now.
Yeah, and
2024, 25.
Oh, yeah, it hasn't changed. And so I thought, well, it might be an idea to find out what the Arab propaganda is. So I started looking into it a bit more deeply. And that's when I began to discover all these other sources, these non-Zionist Jewish sources that had critiqued the movement all along. So that was the first impetus. And then more specifically, in 1967, when that war broke out and it was presented as Israel's response to Arab aggression. And by that time, the Vietnam War was going on. And in the Vietnam War, which to many people living today, that seems like ancient history. But what was happening is that the Americans were bombing and napalming and chemically destroying the whole country and killing millions of people. And the media and the press were lying about it and denying the truth of it. And when I saw in 67 that the same media was all of a sudden cheerleading Israel's attack in June on Egypt and the other Arab countries.
For the third time since its birth as an independent state, Israel is embroiled in a war with the Arab nations that surround her. Her forces are outnumbered 2 to 1.
I thought, well, why would the same media that denies the massacre of the Vietnamese be so committed to supporting Israel? So I began to have serious doubts, and then that's when I did the research. And by fall of that year, I concluded that that war, 67 war, had been fought as a war of expansion and as a war of extending the Zionist project. And that's when I deeply looked into the history of Zionism. So I wouldn't say there was one moment of epiphany. It was more like a process of gradually waking up to reality, just as many Jews are waking up these days, based on what they're seeing in Gaza and the West Bank.
Well, I want to hover on these days because we've talked quite a bit here at The Take about the trauma of Palestinians, but Israel has also invoked trauma to justify its war on Gaza, the trauma of the Holocaust, the trauma of the October 7th attack itself are what often get referenced.
The savagery that we witnessed perpetrated by the Hamas murderers coming out of Gaza were the worst crimes committed against Jews since the Holocaust.
How do you understand the role of trauma in Zionism historically and in Israel's current war on Gaza?
Well, there's no question that the Zionist movement found its major impetus in the trauma of Eastern European Jews in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, where there were terrible persecutions. Then, of course, the unspeakable horror of the Nazi genocide, which, from one point of view, perfectly justified the Zionist perspective that as long as we don't have our own land and our own country and our own army, we're going to be helpless victims of the world. Many of the people on the Jewish side who fought in the war in 1948, what the Palestinians experienced as the Nakba, the disaster, the catastrophe, and Israel considers to be its war of independence. Many of the people fighting in that war on the Jewish side were themselves escapees, refugees from terrible persecution in Eastern Europe. And to them, the Arabs fighting against them were just another set of enemies that wanted to destroy the Jews, which explains some of the horrible cruelty that they practiced upon the Palestinians. Cruelty that has now been uncovered, documented by Israeli historians, but which is rarely ever talked about. And then from that perspective, if you don't know the history, if you don't know any of that, which many people don't because we have a very narrow, selective, and ethnocentric view of history, not just Jews, most people around the world, then October the 7th just seems like another anti-Semitic outrage. And it triggers all that other trauma. And of course, the event itself, with the death of civilians or soldiers for that matter, was traumatic for a lot of Israelis and Jews around the world. So trauma plays a huge role here in shaping the Jewish consciousness. It's not the only factor, and it's not the only important factor, but from the emotional point of view, certainly it is a powerful one.
Yeah. I think what you're saying is why we heard things like this is the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust, framing it as though this was an attack on Jews versus an attack on a state and state actors and people in that state.
Yeah, and you know, that's just the misuse and the abuse and the exploitation, I think very cynical one, of Jewish trauma. Because that wasn't an attack on Jews. That was without justifying the specific events of October 7th, or some of them, or many of them, that was an eruption against an occupation and a siege. And it wasn't targeted at Jews because they were Jews. It was targeted against an occupying power.
More with Gabor Mate after the break. Dr. Mate, you've talked in the past about a mythology around this trauma and how it shows up today. So the idea that in the Holocaust, Jews should have fought back, even though there were people fighting back at that time. Can you walk me through that thinking?
That critique of Eastern European Jews for not fighting back is actually a Zionist propaganda point. The Zionists were terribly dismissive and contemptuous of Eastern European Jews, some of the Zionist leaders. First of all, there was Jewish resistance to the Nazi genocide. There was the incredibly brave and transcendently inspiring revolt in the Warsaw Ghetto, in other ghettos as well, by people that were barely armed against the most powerful military machine in the world, and they fought back as best they could. And secondly, it's very easy to criticize people who've been rendered powerless over time, who've been marginalized. Exactly how was my mother going to fight back against the Nazis with a 3-month-old infant? What was she going to do? So to accuse them of cowardice or weakness is just a slander. And it's a very cynical one, I think.
Your views have made you very popular in some circles and very unpopular in some others, and you don't shy away from confronting that latter circle. So there's a clip that went viral of you interacting with an audience member at a speech that you gave last October here in California, where I am. And in it, the audience member repeats some now debunked claims about the Hamas attack in 2023.
We are approaching October 7th.
Yeah.
When the horrible massacre happened in Israel.
Yeah.
Where young children were murdered, burned, babies in ovens.
That didn't happen. There were no babies in ovens.
Oh, yes, they were.
No, there weren't. That's been refuted even by the Israelis.
And she asks, how do I find compassion for the animals that did that? Your response was sharp and incisive. Can you tell me how you answer these questions?
I know people really like my answer and so on, but if I were to do it again, I'd do it differently.
How so?
I'd ask her, do you really want to find compassion? I actually got into a bit of a interaction with her. I wouldn't anymore. I would actually speak with her much more directly and say, well, what is your actual intention here? If you really want compassion, stop talking about them as animals. If what you want to do is express your rage and your anger, I hear you. Basically, what I want to say to those people is, are you sure you know what you're talking about? I mean, do you really want to know? Because if you want to know, you can find out. These days, if you don't know, it's because you're so committed to your point of view that it excludes any information that in any way would weaken or undermine or even counter your point of view. Like I said to this woman in Anaheim, California, they live in a bubble. And from that point of view, when they hear somebody like me speaking, either I'm totally ignorant, or I'm a sellout, or a traitor, or insane. You know? See, this is a very emotional issue. It's not about intellectual facts or historical facts or debates about realities. These positions are held more from an unconscious emotional commitment, a kind of identification. And it's very difficult for people to let go of their emotional identifications. Those of us Jews that are speaking that way just are too threatening to the self-image of people who are identifying with Israel and Zionism as the expression of Jewishness. So they can't dare allow themselves to look at the actual realities that we're trying to bring to their attention. I understand that. What's interesting is that as we move further generationally, as we move further away from the Nazi Holocaust, younger generations are much more open. So that if you look at many of the campus protesters, they were Jews.
Right.
They were less impacted by the horrors of what happened in the 1940s in Europe. So they're a bit more at liberty to look at reality without that heaviness of that emotional burden. So it's as much of an emotional and psychological issue as it is a political one.
So I want to tap into your expertise here as a trauma expert.
Okay.
Aside from the rhetoric, we've also seen people who are celebrating and glorifying what's been happening in Gaza. So videos, for example, of Israeli soldiers mocking Palestinians, wearing their clothes, making light of blowing up homes. How do you make sense of that behavior?
Number one, if you talk to any Israelis with consciousness and conscience, they will tell you how essentially it's a country that trains its kids to be prepared to fight the Palestinians and to regard them as less than human, right from the beginning. And this is true of any colonial people. Whenever you come into a country and you have to dominate the indigenous population, you have to see them as less than human. And that's not unique to Israel, Palestine. Then there's the shock of October the 7th. I'm not just talking about the genuine grief that a lot of people would have experienced after the October 7th and the deaths of all those people. It was a huge blow to the Israeli ego that these guys on motorcycles and bicycles and armed with rifles came in and they were so effective. That's a huge blow to the Israeli ego, as we're the most powerful army and we're the best army and so on. So there's a significant element of humiliation that the Israelis suffered that day and the desire for revenge. So what we're seeing here in those horrifying, mocking, inhumane TikTok segments is both the results of a lifelong indoctrination and an untrammeled desire for revenge. We're going to show you who's in charge.
Well, finally, Dr. Mate, we're talking in the second week of January. And as we speak, it sounds like there might be a breakthrough in ceasefire talks. Though, of course, we have heard that before. If and when that ceasefire comes, from a trauma perspective, what will you be thinking about the next day?
Well, I'll be remembering all the studies that were done on Palestinian children decades ago about how traumatized they already were decades ago. And they have to multiply it by 1,000. So I'm thinking of the future, of what these kids will have to live through and how that whole people will even rise themselves from the ashes and the rubbles. I mean, think of Los Angeles multiplied by 1 million. That's the first thing I'll be thinking about. I'll be thinking about, well, those Israelis, and there are some very brave ones, very forthright ones, who are trying to infuse some sanity and some conscience into the awareness of their people. Will they find their voices? And will they find some listening? That's the second thing I'll be thinking about. The third thing is rather not cynical, but realistic. There have been ceasefires between Hamas and the Palestinians in general on the one hand and Israel on the other. If you actually look at the history, if you look at the research of somebody like Dr. Norman Finkelstein and others, those ceasefires were broken almost every time by the Israelis. And then the Palestinian response was seen as the aggression. So as long as the Zionist project of making that whole land Jewish, as long as that project continues, any ceasefire is going to be a temporary respite from a very tragic conflict.
Dr. Mate, thank you so much for this conversation and for giving us a window into why we keep seeing what we keep seeing. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I want the whole world to know that I'm a human being. At the end, I am not pen on paper. I'm not anonymous. I'm a human being created by God. Thanks. He then asks a question that I'm going to pose to you. Why aren't Palestinians the ones speaking for our cause? Why are we not there and able to speak? The Palestinian people, the people in Gaza. Why not me? Why not my neighbor? Why not my colleague? Our Palestinian colleagues are not here today because the systems we currently exist in don't recognize the value of Palestinian life. I'm going to end by some reflections from myself and my colleagues who recently came back from Gaza. I'm speaking to you today both as a member of civil society and as a healthcare worker who has witnessed firsthand the death and destruction inflicted upon the Palestinian people. We spent the last 14 months watching as the most live-streamed and documented genocide in history has been met with silence, widespread propaganda campaigns justifying the unjustifiable, silencing and discrediting those who have attempted to expose it. The eyewitnesses that have made it out alive consistently reported crimes that in any other context would have led to sanctions. But here, after 14 months of the most grave breaches of humanitarian law, gross violations of human rights, barbaric war crimes, it is met with impotence by individuals, countries, and the very institution represented by this building. One day, someone will dig up the records of our testimonies, pleading for 14 months. They will dig up the records of Palestinians covering their own genocide when international journalists were unprecedentedly banned from entering. Palestinian children setting up press conferences to tell the world that their lives mattered. We will have to reckon with that history. The precedent that's been set in Gaza, as some of my colleagues here have mentioned earlier, it's going to spread everywhere throughout the world. It signals the demise of rule of law. We've already seen it spread to Lebanon. And as one volunteer surgeon said, when I was in Gaza, I felt like it was a prelude to the end of humanity. If solidarity with your fellow humans is not enough of a reason to act, think about how this is going to spill over. This should be frightening for everyone. I recognize that the words I shared with you today are heavy. But these words pale in comparison to the reality experienced by Palestinians for over 400 days and 76 years before that. Palestinians don't need our pity. They don't need our praise. They need our meaningful and truthful solidarity. And there is no time for despair. In the 24 hours that I'm going to spend in this city, at least 60 children in Gaza will be injured or killed. I recognize that many of you here, by virtue of being here today, are already convinced of the need to act. It takes courage to fight a corrupted system, a system that gives disproportionate to countries with terrible records of global violence. Today, as all of us sit here in the comfort of safety, Dr. Hussam Abu Safiya is in Kamal Adwan Hospital, just discharged from the intensive care unit after he was injured by an Israeli strike. His son was killed not long ago. His 2 daughters are injured. And yet he continues steadfastly to provide care for his patients. He said a few days ago, we will continue to provide this service at any cost to ourselves. The courage and action by Palestinian healthcare workers in the face of this genocide presents an exemplary model for all of us. The question I want to last leave you with is, what are we risking? Thank you.
That's our program. As always, thank you for watching. I'm Mark Hage, and we'll see you in another edition of the Vermont Report on Palestine-Israel.